Tommy Baxter wasn't your typical aspiring chef. From a young age, he was known for his clumsiness rather than his cooking skills. As a kid growing up in a small suburban town, he was more of a disaster in the kitchen than a prodigy. While other children were playing sports or video games, Tommy would be in his mother's kitchen, trying to recreate recipes he had seen on cooking shows. The results, however, were often spectacularly wrong. One of his earliest culinary memories involved trying to bake chocolate chip cookies. It seemed like a simple enough recipe: flour, sugar, butter, and chocolate chips. How hard could it be? As it turned out, much harder than Tommy anticipated. He misread teaspoon as tablespoon and ended up using triple the amount of baking soda, causing the cookies to swell up in the oven like balloons. When his mom walked in to check on him, she found a blackened, smoking tray of misshapen cookies. That was just the beginning of a long series of kitchen mishaps that would define Tommy's culinary journey. By the time he was in high school, Tommy had built up a reputation for his kitchen disasters. His friends joked that if he ever opened a restaurant, it should be called Tommy's Kitchen of Catastrophes. Despite the teasing, he remained undeterred. Tommy knew he had a knack for cooking, even if it didn't always show. He believed that each failure was just a step closer to success. There was a deep passion within him that could not be extinguished by burnt toast or collapsed soufflés. While most people saw his mistakes as embarrassing, Tommy saw them as opportunities to learn. After graduating from high school, Tommy decided to pursue his culinary dreams more seriously and enrolled in a local culinary institute. The moment he stepped through the doors, he felt a sense of purpose. This was where he would hone his skills, learn from the best, and finally prove to everyone, including himself, that he could make it as a chef. But reality hit hard during his very first week of classes. Tommy quickly realized that the precision required in a professional kitchen was far greater than what he had anticipated. Knife skills, for instance, weren't just about chopping vegetables quickly. There was a technique to it, an art form that took practice and precision. His first attempt at julienning a carrot ended with more pieces on the floor than on the cutting board, and a couple of bandages on his fingers. But that didn't stop him. He stayed late after classes, practicing his knife cuts until he could make a perfect brunoise without slicing his hand. Things took an amusing turn during one of his practical exams. The task was to make a classic French bechamel sauce. Simple enough: butter, flour, milk, and a little seasoning. Yet, Tommy managed to create a chaotic situation out of a seemingly straightforward recipe. He heated the butter too quickly, causing it to brown and smoke, then added too much flour, which resulted in a lumpy, dough-like substance. His classmates watched with a mix of amusement and sympathy as he frantically tried to salvage the situation by dumping in milk all at once, only to have the entire pot bubble up and spill over the stovetop. The mishap earned him a new nickname among his peers: Disaster Chef. His instructors, although impressed by his persistence, began to question whether he was cut out for a career in the culinary world. After the bechamel incident, one chef even suggested that Tommy might consider focusing on food writing instead of cooking. But quitting wasn't in his vocabulary. If anything, these setbacks only fueled his determination to improve. Tommy found himself working twice as hard as the other students. While they refined their dishes to near perfection, Tommy focused on mastering the basics, repeatedly making sauces, perfecting his knife skills, and practicing plating techniques. He would often watch cooking shows late into the night, analyzing how the chefs moved in the kitchen, the way they interacted with ingredients, and how effortlessly they seemed to create culinary masterpieces. He began to realize that his path might not look the same as the other aspiring chefs around him, and that was okay. Then came the incident that would go down in culinary school history. During an advanced pastry class, the students were tasked with creating a croquembouche, a towering pyramid of cream puffs bound together with caramel. Tommy was determined to make his look as impressive as the ones he had seen on TV. However, halfway through assembling the pastry tower, disaster struck. The caramel he had been heating became too hot and crystallized, forming a sticky mess. In a desperate attempt to salvage the dish, Tommy tried using the caramelized sugar to glue the cream puffs together. Unfortunately, the caramel hardened too quickly, causing the entire tower to collapse in slow motion. His classmates burst into laughter, and even the instructor couldn't help but chuckle. "Well, Tommy," the chef said, trying to contain his amusement, "you've managed to invent the world's first croquembouche avalanche." Despite the embarrassment, Tommy took it all in stride. He laughed along with everyone else and even took a picture of the fallen pastry tower to remember the moment. To him, it was just another step on the journey, another chapter in his quest to become a chef. With his reputation as the disaster chef solidified, Tommy decided to embrace it. Instead of letting the nickname bring him down, he turned it into a badge of honor. He began to see the humor in his mistakes and realized that they were what made him unique. After all, anyone could learn to cook well, but it took a special kind of person to make a comedy routine out of it. Tommy started brainstorming ideas for how he could turn his chaotic approach into a positive. Perhaps there was a way to teach people that cooking didn't have to be intimidating, that it could be fun, and even a little messy. And so, the idea for a comedic cooking show began to form in his mind. He would call it the Disaster Chef Show, where he would intentionally try challenging recipes while embracing the chaos that unfolded. He hoped to inspire others who felt clumsy in the kitchen to give cooking a try, and to show them that perfection wasn't necessary to enjoy the process. It was the start of a wild new chapter for Tommy Baxter, one that would take him from being the disaster chef to potentially becoming the most unconventional cooking sensation of his generation. With the idea for the Disaster Chef Show buzzing in his head, Tommy Baxter knew he had to first gain some credibility before diving into the world of online content. After all, no one would watch a cooking show made by someone who couldn't actually cook, right? So he decided to make a bold move. He would get a job at a local restaurant to improve his skills in a real-world kitchen environment. That way, he could document his progress and use the experience as material for his future show. There was only one problem. Tommy had never worked in a professional kitchen before, and the idea of working under a head chef was intimidating, to say the least. He applied to numerous restaurants, but his reputation as the disaster chef seemed to follow him even outside of culinary school. Most places turned him down, citing a lack of experience or not the right fit as the reason. Finally, a small quirky restaurant named Benny's Bistro agreed to give him a chance. The place was known for its eclectic menu, ranging from traditional comfort foods to experimental dishes with a twist. It seemed like the perfect place for Tommy to start his culinary redemption. On his first day at Benny's Bistro, Tommy was introduced to Chef Benny, the owner and head chef, a grizzled middle-aged man with a thick beard and an even thicker New York accent. "So, you're the famous disaster chef, huh?" Benny said, giving Tommy a scrutinizing look. "Well, I hope you can keep the disasters to a minimum in my kitchen. I run a tight ship around here." Tommy nodded nervously, feeling a mix of excitement and dread. This was his big chance, and he didn't want to mess it up. But as luck would have it, his first shift didn't go exactly as planned. Tommy was put on prep duty, which seemed simple enough: chopping vegetables, measuring ingredients, and cleaning the kitchen stations. However, when tasked with peeling potatoes, Tommy somehow managed to accidentally fling a potato across the kitchen, nearly hitting a waiter. The staff erupted in laughter, and Chef Benny gave Tommy a playful scolding. "If you're going to start a food fight, at least make sure you're aiming for the customers. They might actually pay extra for the entertainment." Despite the rough start, Tommy gradually found his rhythm. He was determined not to let his reputation define him, and he took every piece of advice from the more experienced staff to heart. He practiced chopping vegetables with precision, learned the different cooking stations, and even picked up some tips on plating dishes to make them look more appealing. Every day presented a new challenge, and while he still made mistakes, they were fewer and farther between. It seemed like, for the first time, Tommy was starting to look like a real chef. Then came the night that would put his progress to the test. It was a busy Friday evening, and the restaurant was packed. The kitchen was buzzing with activity, and orders were piling up. Chef Benny shouted instructions like a drill sergeant, and the line cooks moved in a synchronized dance of chopping, sautéing, and plating. Tommy was assigned to the fry station, a crucial spot during busy hours. His task was to keep up with the orders for fried dishes, which included everything from crispy calamari to sweet potato fries. At first, things were going smoothly, but as the orders continued to come in, Tommy started to feel the pressure mounting. His movements became rushed, and his mind struggled to keep track of the different timers he had set. In his haste, he accidentally dropped a basket of fries into the fryer too quickly, causing the oil to splash out and onto the stovetop, igniting a small flame. The sudden burst of fire caught the attention of everyone in the kitchen. "Fire on the fry station," one of the cooks shouted. Chef Benny rushed over and quickly smothered the flames with a fire blanket. He turned to Tommy, who stood there wide-eyed and frozen, and said, "You all right, kid? Don't worry about it, it happens. Just keep your head in the game." Despite the chaos, Benny's calm demeanor helped Tommy regain his composure. He got back to work, more determined than ever to prove he could handle the pressure. The night ended without further incident, and although Tommy felt embarrassed by the near disaster, he also felt a strange sense of pride. He had faced the heat, literally, and survived. Chef Benny approached him at the end of the shift and gave him a pat on the back. "Listen, Tommy," he said, "every chef has had a close call in the kitchen. What matters is that you kept going. You didn't let the flames scare you off, and that's a good sign in my book." From that day on, Tommy became a little more confident in his abilities. He started to find his own rhythm in the kitchen, learning to work efficiently while adding his own touches to the dishes he prepared. He even began to notice subtle improvements in his cooking. His sauces were smoother, his seasoning more balanced, and his plating more polished. But most importantly, he was starting to have fun again, even when things went wrong. Inspired by his experiences at Benny's Bistro, Tommy began keeping a video diary of his time in the kitchen, recording both his successes and his mishaps. He thought it would make great content for the Disaster Chef Show once he finally launched it. The footage was raw and unfiltered, showing the messy reality of working in a busy restaurant kitchen, and Tommy's candid commentary added a humorous touch. He found himself laughing at his own mistakes more often than feeling ashamed of them. He was beginning to realize that his journey wasn't just about becoming a great chef, it was also about embracing the chaos and finding joy in the process. With a few months under his belt at Benny's Bistro, Tommy was slowly shedding his disaster chef persona, though not completely. He was no longer the rookie who would accidentally set kitchen towels on fire or drop trays of food. He was starting to understand the rhythm of the kitchen, finding his place in the chaos, and even surprising himself with the dishes he was able to create. However, it wouldn't be Tommy if everything went smoothly. The mistakes still happened, but now they were met with laughter and learning instead of frustration. Tommy had begun experimenting with some of his own recipes during quieter shifts. Chef Benny had noticed this budding curiosity and decided to give him a bit more freedom in the kitchen. "Why don't you try putting one of your dishes on the specials menu for tonight?" Benny suggested one day. Tommy's eyes widened. The thought of his food being served to actual paying customers was both exhilarating and terrifying. After some thought, he decided to create his own version of a classic dish, macaroni and cheese, but with a twist. He wanted to add a touch of gourmet to the comfort food by incorporating truffle oil and a blend of 5 different cheeses. The preparation started off well. Tommy carefully crafted the creamy cheese sauce, added the pasta, and folded in the truffle oil. It smelled divine, and for a moment, he felt like a real chef. He plated the dish with a sprinkling of fresh herbs, trying to make it look as elegant as possible. When the first order came in for his mac and cheese special, Tommy's heart raced. This was it, his chance to prove that he could be more than just a cook. As the dish was served, Tommy eagerly watched the dining room from the kitchen door. The customer took a bite, paused, and then made a face. Not just any face, a grimace. Tommy's stomach sank as he saw the customer call over the waiter. It turned out that in his excitement, he had added too much truffle oil, giving the dish an overpowering and almost medicinal taste. The customer's plate was taken back, and Tommy felt like he had failed. When Chef Benny heard what happened, he didn't scold Tommy. Instead, he patted him on the shoulder and said, "You know, kid, no one gets it right the first time. And let me tell you, that's a pretty fancy mistake for your first original dish. Some people pay good money for truffle overload." Benny's ability to find humor in Tommy's failure made it easier to swallow. In fact, the entire kitchen got a kick out of it. One of the line cooks even joked, "Hey Tommy, next time, maybe just serve the truffle oil on the side." The incident didn't discourage Tommy. If anything, it motivated him to keep experimenting, but with a little more caution. He began testing out dishes on the staff before offering them to customers, tweaking recipes and making sure they passed the taste test of Chef Benny and the team. He also kept recording his progress, capturing the ups and downs of his journey. Each failed dish became part of the Disaster Chef brand he was slowly crafting. His video diary was no longer just about his mishaps. It was about growth and turning those mistakes into valuable lessons. A few weeks later, Benny announced a special event at the bistro, a tasting night, where each chef would create a unique dish to be served to a panel of local food critics and VIP guests. It was an opportunity for Tommy to prove himself once again. He knew he couldn't afford another disaster, especially in front of critics. For days leading up to the event, Tommy was in the kitchen early and stayed late, fine-tuning his dish, a deconstructed beef Wellington with a red wine reduction. It was ambitious, and Benny advised him to simplify it, but Tommy was determined to show what he could do. The night of the event arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. The dining room was filled with elegantly dressed guests, the smell of gourmet dishes wafting from the kitchen. Tommy could feel his nerves starting to creep up as his turn approached. His dish was plated beautifully, but just as he was about to carry it out, disaster struck, literally. In his haste to get the plates to the dining room, Tommy tripped over a kitchen mat, sending the dishes crashing to the floor. The kitchen fell silent, and Tommy's cheeks burned with embarrassment. But then, something unexpected happened. Chef Benny walked over to Tommy, looked at the ruined dish, and said, "Well, I guess we'll just have to serve it as deconstructed beef Wellington now, won't we?" The entire kitchen burst into laughter, and even Tommy couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. Benny's humor turned the moment from a complete catastrophe into a story that would be told for years. With no time to start over, Tommy improvised. He scooped up the undamaged portions of the dish, arranged them on a new plate with a bit more flair, and sent it out. To his surprise, the critics loved it. One even remarked that the dish had an avant-garde presentation, praising its boldness. Though Tommy knew it wasn't exactly what he intended, the positive reception felt like a small victory, a sign that he could, in fact, turn his mistakes into something worthwhile. From that moment on, Tommy embraced his chaotic nature. He continued to experiment, but he also learned to adapt quickly when things didn't go as planned. He was becoming the disaster chef, not just in name, but in spirit, a chef who could laugh at himself and make the best out of any situation. And as the tasting night event came to a close, he realized that his true specialty wasn't in perfect dishes, but in the ability to transform culinary disasters into memorable experiences. Tommy's unexpected triumph at the tasting night earned him a new reputation in Benny's bistro. He wasn't just seen as the clumsy chef anymore. He was now the chef who could turn a potential disaster into a memorable dish. The phrase disaster chef began to carry a more endearing tone, as Tommy's ability to recover from setbacks became a running joke and a source of admiration in the kitchen. However, while Tommy's improvisational skills were improving, he still had a long way to go in mastering the fundamentals. And Benny, ever the mentor, wasn't about to let him skip the basics. One morning, as Tommy arrived at the restaurant, he was greeted by Benny holding a thick cookbook titled The Foundations of French Cuisine. "Time to go back to school, kid," Benny announced with a grin. Tommy groaned playfully, but he knew Benny was right. If he wanted to be more than just a chef who got by on charm and quick thinking, he needed to solidify his technical skills. So for the next several weeks, Tommy immersed himself in the art of classic French cooking. The shift was challenging. Tommy had grown used to his improvisational style, where he could bounce back from mistakes. Now, with Benny watching him like a hawk, there was no room for error. The sauces had to be flawless, the knife cuts precise, and there was no skipping steps in the process. Tommy struggled to get the hang of the meticulous techniques, finding it hard to keep up with the discipline and patience required. There were days when he almost felt like he was starting over from scratch, like the time he botched a hollandaise sauce so badly that Benny had to throw it out, saying, "Kid, this isn't hollandaise, it's a science experiment gone wrong." Despite the challenges, Tommy gradually started to understand the value of mastering these skills. His dishes were becoming more refined, and his confidence grew with each small victory in the kitchen. He began to realize that even his beloved disasters were starting to decrease in frequency. Still, he found ways to bring his own chaotic charm into the rigid world of French cuisine. For example, when tasked with preparing a traditional coq au vin, he couldn't resist adding his own twist by incorporating a dash of bourbon into the sauce. At first, Benny was skeptical, but after tasting it, he chuckled and said, "Well, I'll be damned. It actually works." But don't go telling people it's authentic French cuisine. With time, Tommy's video diaries evolved as well. He didn't just focus on the mishaps anymore. He started documenting his growth, sharing the lessons he was learning in the kitchen. His followers loved the new content, and his channel began to grow steadily. Comments poured in from viewers who found his story both relatable and hilarious. The transformation of his channel from a catalog of mistakes to an inspiring, yet comedic journey resonated with many. It seemed people were not only enjoying Tommy's culinary adventures, but they were rooting for him. Just as things were starting to look up for Tommy, Benny dropped a bombshell on him. The bistro would be closing temporarily for renovations, and during that time, the entire staff would be out of work. "You've come a long way, kid," Benny said, "and I don't want you to lose your momentum. So, I'm going to give you a challenge." Benny handed Tommy a plane ticket to Paris. "Go learn from the best. I've got a friend at a little bistro there who could use some extra help in the kitchen. It won't be easy, but if you survive, you'll come back a different chef. Paris. The thought both thrilled and terrified Tommy. He had barely managed to hold his own in Benny's bistro. How was he going to survive in a Parisian kitchen, with chefs who had been perfecting their craft since childhood? Still, Benny's belief in him gave him the courage to accept the challenge. He packed his things, said his goodbyes, and before he knew it, Tommy was on a plane, heading towards what felt like a culinary rite of passage. The Parisian bistro where he'd be working was quaint but renowned, with a staff of seasoned chefs who spoke little to no English. On his first day, Tommy was immediately put to the test. He was placed at the prep station and given the task of slicing a mountain of onions. Within minutes, tears streamed down his face, not just from the onions, but from the overwhelming realization that he was way out of his depth. The head chef, a stern woman named Madame Beaulieu, didn't sugarcoat her thoughts. "Monsieur Baxter, this is not America. We do not have time for your creative disasters here," she said curtly. "Here we do things the right way, or we do not do them at all." Despite the harsh start, Tommy was determined to prove himself. He took every criticism as a lesson, every failure as an opportunity to learn. The language barrier made it harder, but it also forced him to focus on the food in a way he hadn't before. Gradually, Madame Beaulieu's scowl softened, and she began to acknowledge Tommy's resilience. One evening, after a particularly grueling service, she approached him with a slight smile. "You are still a disaster, Monsieur Baxter," she said, "but at least you are now a delicious one." Arriving in Paris had been a whirlwind for Tommy, but as the days turned into weeks, something remarkable began to happen. He started to feel at home in the high-pressure kitchen of Madame Beaulieu's bistro. The constant yelling in French, the endless hours of prep work, and even the cutting criticisms no longer felt like personal attacks. Instead, they became part of his daily rhythm, a kind of culinary boot camp that was forcing him to grow at a pace he never thought possible. Tommy quickly learned that working in a Parisian kitchen was an entirely different beast from his experiences back in New York. Here, there was no room for mistakes, and improvisation was not encouraged. Everything had to be done with precision, and every dish had to meet the incredibly high standards set by Madame Beaulieu. Tommy's clumsy mistakes from the past were not tolerated, and he was pushed harder than ever to get things right the first time. On one particularly grueling day, Madame Beaulieu assigned Tommy the task of preparing the perfect soufflé, a notoriously difficult dish that required precision, timing, and patience. The kitchen was bustling, as usual, with orders flying in from the front, and Tommy could feel the pressure mounting as he whisked the eggs and measured the ingredients. His hands were shaking as he folded the mixture, carefully trying to incorporate air without deflating it. As the soufflés baked, Tommy stared at the oven, his heart racing. He knew that if the soufflés didn't rise properly, he would face a storm of criticism from Madame Beaulieu. The minutes ticked by slowly, and just when he thought he couldn't take the suspense anymore, he saw the soufflés begin to rise perfectly. Relief washed over him, but he knew the final test was still ahead, the taste. When the timer rang, he pulled the soufflés from the oven with trembling hands and brought them to Madame Beaulieu for inspection. She eyed the dish critically, her face giving nothing away. Finally, she took a small spoonful and tasted it. There was a long, torturous pause, and Tommy could feel the entire kitchen watching. Then, in an unexpected twist, she gave a slight nod of approval. "Not terrible," she said, which in Madame Beaulieu's world was practically high praise. That small moment of recognition gave Tommy a surge of confidence. He had never been so focused or disciplined in his life, and it was beginning to show in his work. His knife skills had improved dramatically, his sauces were no longer disasters, and he was mastering techniques he had once thought were beyond him. The strict structure and intense environment were exactly what Tommy needed to hone his skills. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Even with his improvements, Tommy still had his fair share of setbacks. There was the time he accidentally set a dish towel on fire while flambeing a dessert, and the entire kitchen had to stop while they put out the flames. Or the time he misunderstood a French instruction and ended up using salt instead of sugar in a crème brûlée, much to the horror of the patrons. Yet, with every mistake, Tommy learned. The difference now was that his setbacks weren't viewed as signs of failure, they were stepping stones to mastery. Beyond the technical skills, Tommy began to appreciate the artistry behind French cuisine. Madame Beaulieu's kitchen was not just about cooking, it was about creating something beautiful, something that could evoke emotion. Tommy started to see food as a form of expression, and he realized that while technique was important, it was equally crucial to infuse each dish with passion and creativity. And while Madame Beaulieu might have been strict about technique, she couldn't deny the creative spark that Tommy brought to the kitchen. His creativity came to the forefront when Madame Beaulieu tasked him with creating a special dish for a prestigious event the bistro was catering. Tommy's heart pounded at the opportunity. This was his chance to prove himself. After brainstorming ideas late into the night, he came up with a modern twist on the classic French dish, ratatouille. His version incorporated unconventional ingredients like roasted garlic foam and crispy pancetta, elements that would have been considered sacrilege in a traditional French kitchen. The day of the event arrived, and Tommy's dish was served alongside the other meticulously crafted plates from the bistro's menu. As the guests sampled the food, Tommy watched nervously from the kitchen. Madame Beaulieu, standing nearby, said nothing but raised an eyebrow when she saw the modern twist Tommy had added. He couldn't tell if she was impressed or appalled. But when the feedback came in, it was overwhelmingly positive. Guests raved about the creativity and boldness of the dish, calling it a refreshing take on a classic. Madame Beaulieu, though not one to shower anyone with compliments, simply nodded at Tommy and said, "You're not quite a disaster anymore, Baxter." That night, Tommy celebrated with the kitchen staff, toasting with a glass of champagne that Madame Beaulieu herself had handed him. It was a far cry from the bumbling novice who had nearly burned down Benny's Bistro back in New York. He was far from perfect, but Tommy had finally started to believe in himself as a real chef. After his success with the ratatouille, Tommy's confidence soared. He wasn't just surviving in Madame Beaulieu's kitchen anymore, he was thriving. He found himself experimenting more and more with French techniques and adding his unique flair, blending classic methods with his own quirky creativity. Soon enough, the entire kitchen staff began to respect him, even if begrudgingly at first. They no longer saw him as the clumsy American, but as someone who had earned his place in one of the most competitive kitchens in Paris. But with success came a new challenge. Tommy started to feel restless. The creative spark that had fueled his journey was now pushing him in a new direction. He loved working at the bistro, but he also craved more freedom to create dishes that truly represented his personality, a fusion of the traditional and the unexpected, much like his own life. The idea of starting his own restaurant began to creep into his thoughts. It was a wild idea, especially considering how far he had come from the days of setting his own kitchen on fire back in New York. Still, the thought of having a space where he could serve dishes without the strict confines of tradition excited him. He began to sketch out ideas in a small notebook he carried around. Notes on potential menus, restaurant themes, and even names. His favorite idea? Baxter's Bites, a playful homage to his name and his penchant for turning the culinary world on its head. One evening after service, Tommy sat at the bar in the bistro, nursing a glass of wine and staring at his notebook. Madame Beaulieu, who had noticed his quiet contemplation over the past few weeks, approached him. "You're thinking about something bigger, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low but with that familiar sharpness. Tommy hesitated but nodded. "I've been thinking about opening my own place. Something small, something different." Madame Beaulieu stared at him for a moment before nodding. "I knew this day would come," she said, almost wistfully. "You have ambition, Baxter. It was clear from the moment you set foot in my kitchen, even if you were a disaster then. Now, you're only a partial disaster." Tommy laughed, feeling a mixture of relief and gratitude. He had expected her to be furious or dismissive, but instead, there was a glint of respect in her eyes. "Thank you, chef," he said, his voice sincere. "But know this," she continued, her expression turning serious. "Running a restaurant is not just about making food. It's about managing people, understanding business, and constantly battling obstacles. You think the kitchen is hard? Wait until you're the one calling the shots." Tommy nodded. He had learned that the hard way back at Benny's Bistro, but now he felt more prepared. He wasn't just the wide-eyed dreamer anymore. He had been forged in the fires of Beaulieu's kitchen and had come out stronger. Within a few months, Tommy had saved up enough and secured a small charming space in a quieter part of Paris. It wasn't big, but it had character, just like him. The walls were adorned with art that reflected both French and American influences, and the open kitchen allowed diners to watch as Tommy worked his magic. The menu was a blend of traditional French cuisine with unexpected twists: duck confit tacos, escargot sliders, and a foie gras milkshake that sounded ridiculous but had people coming back for more. The opening night was nerve-wracking. Tommy had invited a mix of food critics, industry professionals, and a few friends he had made along the way. As the clock ticked toward the opening, Tommy's nerves began to fray. What if no one showed up? What if the food wasn't good enough? What if the critics tore him apart? But just as his doubts threatened to overwhelm him, the first guests arrived. The kitchen roared to life, and Tommy, in his element, got to work. Dish after dish went out, each plate more daring than the last, each bite designed to challenge and delight the senses. By the end of the night, Tommy was exhausted but exhilarated. The critics had praised the food, calling it bold, inventive, and just the right amount of chaotic. The guests had raved about the atmosphere, the creativity, and most importantly, the food. Madame Beaulieu had even come, though she stayed toward the back of the room, observing with her usual sharp eyes. As the night came to a close, she approached Tommy, her expression unreadable. "I suppose I should congratulate you," she said, her tone dry. "Though your foie gras milkshake is an abomination, even by my standards." Tommy grinned. "I knew you'd hate it." "I do," she said, but a small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "But you've done well, Baxter. Don't let it go to your head." And with that, she left, disappearing into the Paris night. As Tommy cleaned up the kitchen, he reflected on how far he had come, from the bumbling disaster at Benny's Bistro to the proud owner of Baxter's Bites. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. With Baxter's Bites officially open and the buzz growing, Tommy's life became a whirlwind. His restaurant was doing better than he could have imagined. The press loved his quirky menu, and word of mouth spread rapidly through Paris. What had started as a small passion project was quickly turning into a destination for adventurous food lovers. But success, as Tommy would soon discover, brought new challenges. As the restaurant's popularity soared, so did the expectations. Every night, more and more diners arrived, and Tommy found himself stretched thin. The once small and cozy atmosphere of Baxter's Bites became a bustling hub, with lines out the door and reservations booked weeks in advance. Tommy was no longer just a chef. He was now a businessman, a leader, and a brand. And with that came an enormous amount of pressure. At first, he tried to juggle everything himself. He was determined to keep the personal touch that had made his restaurant special, but as the demand grew, it became impossible. The kitchen staff, though loyal, was overworked, and Tommy's perfectionism was starting to take its toll. He spent long hours in the kitchen, sometimes well past closing, tweaking recipes and overseeing every detail. Exhaustion set in, and soon, cracks began to show. One night, after a particularly busy dinner service, Tommy collapsed into a chair in the kitchen, his head in his hands. His sous chef, a no-nonsense woman named Amelie, approached him, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're burning yourself out, Tommy," she said, her voice firm but sympathetic. Tommy looked up, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "I don't know what to do, Amelie. The restaurant is growing faster than I can keep up with. I feel like I'm losing control of everything." Amelie sat down across from him. "You can't do it all on your own. You have to trust us, trust the team. We're here because we believe in you and your vision. But you need to let go of some of the control." Tommy knew she was right, but it was easier said than done. Baxter's Bites was his baby, and the thought of handing over the reins, even just a little, terrified him. But as the pressure mounted, he realized he had no choice. The next day, Tommy made the tough decision to hire a general manager to handle the business side of the restaurant, freeing him up to focus on what he did best, creating amazing food. It was a difficult transition, but one that ultimately saved him from complete burnout. With the right team in place, Baxter's Bites continued to thrive, and Tommy found a new rhythm, one that allowed him to maintain his creativity without sacrificing his sanity. But just as things seemed to be settling down, a new opportunity presented itself, one that would change the course of Tommy's career forever. One afternoon, as Tommy was preparing for the evening service, he received a call from an unexpected source, a well-known American television producer. They were developing a new cooking competition show and were looking for contestants with unique stories and culinary styles. The producer had heard about Baxter's Bites and was intrigued by Tommy's unconventional journey to success. At first, Tommy was hesitant. A TV show? It seemed like a crazy idea, especially considering how busy he already was with the restaurant. But the more he thought about it, the more it appealed to him. This was a chance to take his story, and his food, to a global audience. Plus, it sounded like fun. And Tommy, despite the seriousness of running a restaurant, had always been driven by a sense of fun and adventure. After discussing it with his team, who were all enthusiastic about the idea, Tommy agreed to audition for the show. A few weeks later, He found himself standing in front of a panel of celebrity chefs and food critics, ready to compete. The show, called Culinary Clash, was unlike anything Tommy had experienced. Each week, contestants were given a mystery ingredient and tasked with creating a dish under intense time pressure. Tommy, with his quirky approach to cooking, quickly became a fan favorite. His dishes were bold, inventive, and often hilariously unpredictable. One week, he made a dessert out of pickles and chocolate, something that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. Another week, he turned a savory beef stew into a deconstructed pie that wowed the judges. But it wasn't just his food that won people over, it was Tommy himself. His clumsy charm, his self-deprecating humor, and his genuine love for cooking made him stand out in a sea of more polished contestants. Viewers connected with his story of perseverance, and even when he made mistakes, his ability to laugh at himself endeared him to millions. As the weeks went by, Tommy advanced through the competition, making it all the way to the finals. The finale was a nail-biting showdown between Tommy and a renowned Michelin-starred chef. The pressure was immense, but Tommy, true to form, stayed true to his style, taking risks, embracing the chaos, and having fun. When the final dish was presented, a complex fusion of French and American flavors that only Tommy could have imagined, the judges were stunned. It wasn't just a good dish, it was a masterpiece, a perfect representation of Tommy's journey from bumbling amateur to culinary icon. And when they announced the winner, Tommy could hardly believe his ears. He had done it. Against all odds, he had won Culinary Clash. The victory catapulted him to international fame. Suddenly, Tommy was everywhere. Interviews, magazine covers, guest appearances on talk shows. Baxter's Bites became a global sensation, with people traveling from all over the world to taste the food of the chef who had once set his own kitchen on fire. But through it all, Tommy remained the same, humble, goofy, and forever grateful for the wild, unpredictable ride that had brought him to where he was. With his win on Culinary Clash, Tommy Baxter's life transformed almost overnight. Not only was he now a household name, but his quirky cooking style had inspired countless amateur chefs around the world. People loved the idea that you could be successful in the kitchen without being perfect, something Tommy embodied in every chaotic, endearing way. But fame, as Tommy quickly discovered, came with its own set of ridiculous challenges. Suddenly, he was getting requests to do all kinds of things that had nothing to do with cooking. One day, his agent called with an unusual proposition, a toothpaste commercial. "They want me to what?" Tommy asked, holding the phone in one hand and a spatula in the other. He had been in the middle of trying to create a gourmet hot dog when the call came through. "They want you to brush your teeth on camera while holding one of your famous dishes," his agent replied, clearly trying not to laugh. "Wait, hold on. You're telling me they want me to advertise toothpaste while holding a hot dog?" "Not just any hot dog," his agent corrected. "Your signature hot dog." Tommy scratched his head, smearing a bit of mustard across his forehead in the process. He wasn't sure what his culinary skills had to do with dental hygiene, but in the spirit of embracing the weirdness of his newfound fame, he agreed. The commercial shoot turned out to be an even bigger disaster than he had anticipated. In true Tommy fashion, everything went hilariously wrong. First, he accidentally squirted toothpaste onto the hot dog instead of the brush. Then, while trying to recover from that blunder, he knocked over a glass of milk, which splashed across the pristine white set. By the end of the shoot, Tommy had toothpaste in his hair, ketchup on his shirt, and a crew of cameramen in hysterics. The commercial was, predictably, never aired. But footage from the blooper reel somehow leaked online, and it went viral within hours. Fans couldn't get enough of Tommy's clumsiness, and soon he was fielding offers for even more bizarre opportunities. There was a children's show that wanted him to teach kids how to cook without using the stove, a reality show that involved chasing chickens through a field. Tommy was still unclear on how that related to food, and even a request to model for a line of aprons, something he actually considered for a minute before realizing he didn't own an iron. Meanwhile, Baxter's Bites continued to flourish, though Tommy himself spent less time in the kitchen and more time attending wacky events. One evening, after a particularly chaotic celebrity cooking competition where he accidentally set a creme brulee on fire, again, Tommy found himself reflecting on the whirlwind his life had become. Sure, he had made a few mistakes along the way. Okay, a lot of mistakes. But in the end, his imperfections had become his greatest asset. People loved him not because he was the best chef, but because he was relatable. He wasn't afraid to mess up, to laugh at himself, and to keep going no matter what ridiculous obstacle came his way. And that, he realized, was what had made his journey so special. Tommy smiled as he looked around the bustling dining room of Baxter's Bites, now filled with diners from all over the world, eagerly awaiting his next wild creation. He had turned his dreams into reality, not in the way he had imagined, but in a way that was uniquely his own. As if on cue, one of the waiters rushed into the kitchen, panicked. "Chef, we have a situation." Tommy sighed, bracing himself for whatever culinary catastrophe awaited him. "What is it this time? Another chocolate sriracha disaster?" "No," the waiter replied, looking serious. "The mayor is here, and he's asking for your toothpaste hot dog." Tommy blinked. "He wants what?" "You know, the thing from the commercial that went viral?" Tommy burst into laughter, shaking his head. "Of course, he does. All right, let's make this happen. One toothpaste hot dog coming right up." As Tommy assembled the absurd dish, he couldn't help but chuckle. His life had become one long hilarious adventure, full of mishaps and mischief. And honestly, he wouldn't have had it any other way.